because I fed Charizard every day,
Mhm.
and I fed him quite big meals. And I think, because I think when we go talk about monitor lizards, we think of these like very hyperactive carnivores that need to eat, are constantly eating food, things like that. But at the end of the day, they still are reptiles, and so they don't have the same metabolic need for energy from food as mammals do.
Hello and welcome to Ep.1 of the Terrarium Talk Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Terrence Hay, and today we will be discussing Varanus Acanthurus, also known as the Ackie Monitor. This species in particular hails from the northwest quadrant of Australia, has all the hyper-intelligent behavior you would expect in a monitor, but in a much smaller, more reasonable package. Today's guest is Dr. Eric Los Kamp. He is an exotic animal and wildlife veterinarian at Winter Park Veterinary Hospital in Winter Park, Florida. He has aspirations of being board certified in reptile and amphibian medicine, and he is also an avid Ackie keeper. In this podcast, we'll be discussing his personal experiences in caring for Ackies, as well as addressing some pressing challenges and opportunities in the field of herpetoculture. All right, welcome, Dr. Eric Los Kamp. How are you today?
I'm good. How about you?
Good. How's Tyranitar doing?
He's doing really good. So he's just hiding in the rock sack right behind me. He's currently on some medications right now, just doing some antibiotic injections just because of the tail, and he's doing really good otherwise. He's eating really well. He's just being a little tank.
Awesome. So I have to ask, what initially drew you to working with Ackie Monitors?
So I've really been in the monitor lizards for a long, long time. And so like when I was in high school, I worked with a Savannah monitor, and that's where I really started to really love the monitor lizards and their personalities and how intelligent they are. When I was in vet school, I ended up getting a Uromastyx as like my first reptile kind of like on my own as my own pet. But the other species I was looking at the same time was Ackies. I think just the way their size is a lot more manageable compared to other monitor lizards. They're just as inquisitive and curious, and they have that same kind of personality of a monitor lizard, and they're in a much smaller package. And I think when I got my first one, Charizard, it just kind of sealed the deal. Like they're just so inquisitive and they're so wonderful, and so I just absolutely love them.
So I was wondering, because I haven't had an Ackie myself, but I know with Cyrax, my black throat monitor, there's certain body cues or body languages that you got to know how to read if you're gonna get anywhere near one.
Yes.
So what would you say is something that you look out for when you're interacting with them, or at least when you first started interacting with them?
So when I kind of my way of taming for Ackies is, especially when they're young and they're babies, they are very like kind of fight or flight mode, because at that size in the wild, they're prey items for a lot of different animals and different things. So I try and never force handle. Like force handling is never the way to bond with your animal, because they're just going to associate you with stress. And yes, they may calm down in your hand, but then that's just like because they've thoroughly exhausted themselves. What I tend to look for and what I tend to do is I primarily use a lot of tongue feeding in my training, because I initially will start, I'll put some of the food, I'll tongue feed some food into the food bowl. So then while he's hiding in the rock stack, my Ackie can then start to recognize, okay, the tongue means food. Food is coming from the tongs. And then when they're within the first week, I try to just start tongue feeding them.
Mm-hmm.
And from my experience, they tend to take it to the tongs right away. I've only had 2 Ackies, so I can't really say that this works for every single animal, but for the 2 that I have, and they both kind of have different personalities in their own ways, but it's worked with them very well, and they both respond very well to that. And then from there, it's this kind of like kind of like the quote what Nerd and Kevin McCurley say, it's like threads of trust. So I just kind of leave my hand in the enclosure, I sit around the room the enclosure's in, let them get used to my presence, and then I just try slowly moving my hand closer and closer to them. And the main thing I really look for to know that it's positive is I look for the eyes, I look at the way he's like inflating their bodies, things like that. So Ackies are a little bit different for being Odroftria from other monitor lizards, but in general, you want them to have nice long conflicts. You don't want their pupils to be very dilated. If you start to see your monitor lizard like closing their eyes at all, that's a sign of stress. You really just want them to be really just inquisitive, and you just want them just to be looking at you. If I haven't really seen too many Ackies doing this, but if they're huffing, if they kind of start, like if you start to see their neck kind of puff up a little bit, if they start to kind of Ackies, I haven't really seen Ackies whip their tails that much, but if they start to kind of get into, excuse me, a defensive posture, then you want to, you want to kind of back off, let them calm down a little bit, don't approach them further, and just kind of sit there and just wait them out. And I think patience is the other major aspect of taming, is just you want to just make sure that you're working on their time, because they're going to warm up to you when they feel comfortable, and you can't force that.
Interesting. Yeah, because with my black throat, I've noticed that when in the times that he does get defensive, I would say 95% of the time he's going to try to whip. Like it's extremely unlikely that he would actually try to bite. So you would say that's not the case with Ackies, in your opinion?
Ackies, I've never really seen, and I think it's because of like their ecology and things like that. They're not that large of a lizard. They have those spiny tails because in Australia, where they're from, if they see something that's potentially going to eat them, they'll try to run into a burrow. They inflate their chests and inflate their bodies, and they put that spiny tail up so that if something's trying to grab them, they hit the spines. And so I think that it's more of just like that behavioral thing. And for other monitor lizards, if they have the tail, for the larger ones like black throats, Asian water monitors, Argus monitors, the tail is at least like it's a little bit further away from like the neck and from the body. So they do a tail whip, that can be a nice way of just saying, "Hey, get away from me," without then exposing them to any vulnerable areas for the predator to attack or anything.
That's interesting. What so what are some of the challenges and rewards of keeping Ackies?
So let's go over the challenges first.
Sure.
I think finding them, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because they are becoming a lot more popular as more and more people are starting to become aware of them. But you just want to make sure you're getting, and the nice thing about Ackies is that they're all captive bred, so you don't have to deal with any wild caught animals, things like that. You just want to make sure you're just getting them from, because then anyone can really breed, like a really high quality breeder, or just someone that's literally just doing it in the back for fun in their in their basement. So it's really just making sure that the animals are healthy, and just making sure that you're getting them from a quality breeder, regardless of whether it's their full-time job or it's their hobby or passion, because I also want to eventually get into breeding on my own, things like that, but definitely not going to be my main income, just something I just want to be passionate about and feel and self-sustain my hobby for these reptiles. But I think just making sure you know where to get them. I think also the initial kind of learning curve for a monitor lizard and for an Ackie in general is, I think, the other big challenge, just because they take a lot of the foundations of reptile husbandry with humidity, substrates, temperature, and they dial it up quite a bit, just because of how hot they need their basking spots, how important microclimates and humidity are for them, and just the amount that they eat, because they are a lot more, they eat a lot of insects, and they eat quite frequently. Like when I first got my Ackie, I didn't think I'd have like grasshopper colonies and discoid roach colonies and crickets, like, and mealworms in like a little like private fridge. Like I have insects up the wazoo now. So and like I've kind of become like an insect farmer. So I think that's part of that, just that learning curve. I would say the rewards are honestly really amazing, because I think like once you get over that initial like really high learning curve, they are their everyday maintenance is really not that bad, and it's pretty standard for most reptiles. And then it's really, you just get to bond with your animal. And monitor lizards they're like among the most intelligent of all the reptiles, and so the way that they just express themselves and they express their personalities, and they can, like, I almost feel like they understand and they can pick you out as an individual person. Like Tyranitar for me is a lot more outgoing, and he'll crawl on my arm, and he will be a lot more willing to come out for me. But like if my wife or any of my friends will try to feed him, he's a little bit more reserved, and he's not nearly as outgoing. He still grabs it, which I'm really happy, because I'm happy that he's at least open enough to grab food from anybody, but he definitely is a little more reserved with other people. So I think really the benefits of an Ackie are really just the absolute fun it is to really form a relationship with this animal.
That's really cool. And yeah, with the monitor that I keep, that's one thing I noticed. It just absolutely stuns me because I've kept other reptiles. I mean, obviously I have tortoises, I have some water turtles, geckos, but the Ackie monitor, I mean, just monitors in general, just completely blew me away.
Yeah.
Interacting with Cyrax for the first time, just the head cocks and the eye movement reminded me. It was almost bird like.
Yeah, no, definitely like working with a little bird of prey, and not to like, some of them are a little bit dog like, some of them are a little bit more cat like. My first Ackie Charizard, I felt like he was more of a dog. Like I would open the cage, he'd crawl right up my arm, and he was just a very outgoing animal. Tyranitar, he's outgoing. He's not as outgoing as Charizard is. I think, just a different animal. They're just different personalities, but he likes to observe a little more. It almost seems like he has a nervous look on his face, and he's always examining the surroundings like a little bit more carefully than Charizard did. So that's why I kind of calling him a little more cat-like. But he's still the Tyranitar is still very social for an Ackie, and so it's very interesting how their personalities can be different even for the same species.
Can you tell us about a memorable challenge or experience while working with Tyranitar and Charizard, I guess?
I think for the one for Charizard was really just, I think, part of that learning curve and just the enclosure, because when I had set up like the way I had set up Charizard's enclosure initially towards the end of his life, it looks very different. Like, learning about big boxes, learning, trying to build multiple different basking spots, trying to build those microclimates, things like that, trying just to modify and tweak just then depending on what he was doing and what I was seeing from his behavior. That was, I think, my most memorable challenge with Charizard. With Tyranitar, it's been more of just his tail and just kind of those factors. And so I had just noticed that he just was starting to have some stuff shed on his tail. And, so I have been making sure I have multiple hygrometers in my enclosure. I have one on the warm end, I have one on the cool end, I have one on my substrate. So, and I spray his enclosure around daily because I tend to keep my enclosures a little bit higher humidity than other care guides. Like I try to hit around 50 to 70 like
Oh
during the
wow.
day. And
Okay.
then like I try to get to like around like, if I can get to like spikes of 90% and like really, really high at night, and then let it like drain during the night. I try to get that just because Ackies do get a lot of that water from breathing in humid, warm air. And so, so I've been trying to monitor that. And then I just continued to notice that he just really wasn't getting this shed off his tail. And so I tried also soaking him. I tried kind of helping manually, gently debriding, definitely not raking and scraping off, but on the tip of his tail, he did have a little bit of, it was like when I peeled the skin off, it was very pink and very ulcerated.
Oh
And
wow.
so so to me, it was either like, the skin was just really not healthy and it wasn't really viable. And I guess kind of kept an eye on it. I was just really monitoring it. And I think just because it was on the tip of his tail, I think that it just started, and especially under the heat of his heat bulbs and the dirt, it just started to constrict a little bit. So to
Oh wow.
preserve his tail and help preserve him, I ended up amputating like I think at least half of his tail, and he's doing well now. I've started, as I've kind of been continuing soaking him and just continuing with the shed, I have started to see a recurrence of this kind of like really raw skin. So that's why he's on the antibiotic injections. But I've done blood work on him. I've done x-rays. He doesn't have any like bone infections or any other signs of a systemic infection. All of his blood work is normal. So I'm really just keeping an eye on it, and I'm trying to balance. I'm trying just to really staying on top of his humidity levels and just doing that. So I would say that's been my most memorable challenges with Tyranitar so far.
As someone who's also worked in veterinary medicine, I am interested in how exactly do you get blood from
Mm,
a monitor lizard, for example.
mm.
I've done different mammals, which I mean I figure that's probably going to be a little easier. Monitors, though, I would have no idea where to draw blood
Right.
from.
And so with Tyranitar, and usually at my practice, I usually will give like kind of the hyperactive animals a little
Mhm.
bit of a sedative. So
Mhm.
it's really it's a drug called midazolam. Essentially, is Valium. It's in the same class as Valium. So it really allows the animal to just reduce their stress levels and to be a little bit calmer. Because if I feel like if I tried to do Tyranitar's blood awake and sedate
Yeah,
when he was
there's
at
no
his
way.
full prime, he's going to be wiggling around. It's going to be a lot more difficult. So you can do it, and there is ways to do it, but I think just to minimize his stress and to do that, I like to just give him a little bit of a sedative. And then they have a nice vein in the tail, the ventral tail vein, or the more scientific name is the ventral coccygeal vein. So essentially, I approach from the side of the tail and I hit that vein and I just pull back and I get the blood from there. And that's usually where I get blood from most tailed reptiles is where usually where I get the blood from.
Okay, that's
Mhm.
interesting. Uh,
Yeah.
do you have any tips for someone new to keeping Ackies? Any knowledge
Mm.
that you wish you had when you first started?
I would definitely say probably. I'm trying to think. Definitely start rearing insects. I think before you get the animal, or
Mhm.
get the insect colonies when you get your Ackie, because you're going to save a lot of money that way. I would definitely try. If you haven't heard about him, or if you haven't don't know him, shout out to Kai Fan. He breeds grasshoppers in the United States. Grasshoppers are a very good staple feeder for these guys. I really like them. So I would get a colony of grasshoppers from Kai, really try to propagate those guys. Get roaches. Dubia or discoid, depending on where you are in the country. Like I'm in Florida, so I can't get dubia roaches, so that's why I have discoids. But
Mhm.
just try to get those insect colonies started sooner rather than later, because you're going to save a lot of money in the long run, and it's going to be a lot more affordable to feed your growing monitor lizard. And then the other thing I think too is feeding frequency, because I fed Charizard every day
Mhm.
and I fed him quite big meals. And I think, because I think when we go talk about monitor lizards, we think of these like very hyperactive carnivores that need to eat, are constantly eating food, things like that. But at the end of the day, they still are reptiles, and so they don't have the same metabolic need for energy from food as mammals do. And so just controlled and less frequent meals are going to be a lot and going to prolong the health of your animal. It's going to make sure your animal doesn't get obese, avoids fatty liver disease, and that's going to really help your animal in the long run with other diseases as well.
Interesting. With
Mm-hmm.
your experience with your Ackies,
Mm-hmm.
I believe they're classified as insectivores. So you
Mm-hmm.
would you not recommend feeding them like egg or shrimp?
I typically don't. I try
Mhm.
to keep my guys solely on insects. I feel
Mhm.
like if you're going to do egg, I would do that as like a once a month or once blue moon type treat.
Mhm.
Just heavily, I would if you can get like the shell in there as well. The shell is a very good source of calcium, but if you're not going to add the shell, just make sure you're heavily supplementing with multivitamins and calcium, just because the egg by itself doesn't really have that much. But I typically just stick to mostly insects. So like for me, the bulk of my diet for my Ackie is grasshoppers, because when you look at studies of wild Ackies, that's what their gut reflects as well. The majority of the gut contents of these wild animals are locusts and grasshoppers, and so grasshoppers make the bulk, and then the next smaller part is roaches,
Mhm.
and then following that is just a variety of other insects. So I like to use giant mealworms and crickets for Tyranitar. I tried. You can use other things like black soldierfly larvae and silkworms. I have tried those with Tyranitar. Tyranitar does not like them, so it's going to be kind of dependent on your animal. You can. I have also tried worms as an occasional treat, just because hornworms are very full of water, and so for maintaining hydration in your animal, hornworms are very good. Tyranitar also doesn't like the hornworms, so it's really just kind of seeing what your animal responds. But for me, like my four staple insect feeders are grasshoppers, discoid roaches, crickets, and giant mealworms.
Okay, awesome.
Mhm.
Is there any enrichment that you do for him in particular?
Yeah, and so his enclosure, I have a reed stack made of slate rock, so he
Mhm.
can crawl up and down that. I have multiple cork panels in the back, so He can climb up, and I'm in a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot enclosure, which for me, like for one Ackie, is like the absolute minimum.
Mhm.
If I can give him bigger, I would. But so if I'm using it, since I'm using an enclosure this size, I like to make sure that the walls are climbable. I also have like a magnetic rock ledge that he can climb up. Also just giving him lots of substrate. He has a nice deep substrate layer because the enclosure, at least I can provide that because I am using some over the top screen top lighting. I also have a nice deep dig box in there that he can dig through. And then really just enrichment through tongue feeding, just getting him running around, getting him to interact with me, and then also just kind of like causing mental stimulation with that. And then I do try to cycle my substrate often. I do have this enclosure bioactive fully, so there's superworm beetles, there's isopods, stringtails, and I have some mundo grass in here as well.
Oh wow, that's really awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
That's really cool that you have the cork bark on the or panels on the walls as well, because that way you're actually maximizing the space.
Yes. And if
Um,
you're gonna use a smaller enclosure for an Ackie, like I recommend maximizing the wall coverage as much as they can because these guys are very active. They will climb, they will dig, even though they are like more of a fossorial terrestrial species, they do take advantage of any height that you give them. So if you have the tools and the opportunities to give them extra wall space or use your wall space and make it usable space in the enclosure, I would do it.
that's awesome.
Yeah.
So looking ahead, what do you see as the most pressing challenges or opportunities in the field of herpetoculture, and how do you envision it evolving in the future?
So for opportunities, I do think just kind of reptile medicine as it evolves and as we learn more about husbandry, that's really going to help prolong the lives of animals. It's going to help minimize diseases and like nutritional diseases, metabolic diseases, and it's really going to let us understand these animals better. Like I'm currently doing a study on gout in Odotria, and so
Mhm.
not just Ackies, but Kimberley rock monitors, really any of the Australian dwarf monitor lizards. My first Ackie Charizard had passed away from gout, and so I kind of just trying, and then hearing other people having lost their Ackies and other dwarf monitors to gout. I'm currently working on this study, kind of looking at the different factors in husbandry and diet and in varanid physiology, trying to figure out like, are there any underlying factors in our current practices that are predisposing these animals to this? So I think through continued education on both the husbandry and the veterinary side, we can really help advance and elevate the care of these animals. And in terms of challenges, I think legislation. So I know so the Holy Thursday massacre has just
No.
recently happened.
Yeah.
If you guys aren't aware of that, Chris Coffey, Bill Adam had lost a lot of the snakes. FWC had used a captive bolt gun to euthanize around 35 reticulated and Burmese pythons. They also accidentally misidentified a boa constrictor. Um, so really just kind of, and then, there was also the Lacey Act amendments in 2021 with the Competes Act. So really just, I think, teaching people and using, as much as it's a traumatic and a really horrible event, what is what happened with Chris Coffey's and Bill McAdams snakes, using these opportunities to create change to, whether that be regulation, like different regulations, changing organizations that are regulating the reptile hobby and the reptile industry, but regardless of the action that is taken, just promoting the welfare of these animals because, these guys, they can't speak for themselves.
Mhm.
We as the reptiles in general are usually in the public eye, usually are the cold-blooded scaly monsters. So for us that are the reptile keepers, we kind of advocate for these guys. And so really getting your voice heard, joining USARK Florida, getting involved with those organizations and just spreading awareness for these issues like the Holy Thursday Massacre and other things is really going to help show people and show the rest of the world what these animals really mean to us.
That's a pretty good answer. This is this has been a very enlightening conversation, and I really appreciate you for coming on. This is actually the
Yeah, of
first
course.
episode, so it's of
Oh,
course
really?
it's got to be a banger. So
All right.
of
I'm
course I've got to
glad.
have you on.
Oh, I appreciate that a lot. Oh, I'm glad that we were able to do this.